Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this pivotal session at the Health Equity and Action Summit 2024 here in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. My name is Edie Stringfellow, and it is my pleasure to moderate this incredibly important discussion on policy, crafting an AI legislation agenda. We stand at this exhilarating intersection of technology and healthcare where artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming the way we approach health outcomes. But with this tremendous power comes an even greater responsibility. Today, we'll delve into how we can shape a legislative agenda that ensures AI is utilized not just as a tool for efficiency, but as a vehicle for equity. As we learn and connect over this next hour, we hear from experts who are leading the charge in this exciting domain. Sarah, the health policy and AI lead from the National Conference of State Legislators, and Renée Cummings, a trailblazer in data science and social impact from the University of Virginia. And last but not least, Michael Crawford, host and executive producer of the 21st Century Health Podcast. And if you guys would not mind taking a moment to introduce yourselves to the audience, that'd be great.
Well, thank you very much for that. I am Renée Cummings. I am a data science professor at the University of Virginia. I'm an AI ethicist and a data activist. I am a criminologist by profession and a criminal psychologist. And I have spent the last nearly 2 decades working in public health from the angle of treating with homicide, crime reduction, and just bringing an epidemiological perspective to criminal justice. It is my work in criminology that led me to artificial intelligence, looking at the ways in which algorithms and data were amplifying or creating these zombie predictions of the risk of Black and brown men. I'm also part of the Brookings Institute, working along with Michael in the AI Equity Lab. I'm part of the World Economic Forum's AI and Data Equity Council, and I spend an extraordinary amount of time thinking about ways in which we need to govern this technology responsibly, make it safe, and to build trust into AI.
Thank you. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Michael Crawford. I am the AVP of Strategy and Innovation at Howard University's Office of Health Affairs. I'm also the founder and executive director of Howard University's 1867 Health Innovations Project, which is our digital health innovation program, where we look at the broad category of digital health and specifically artificial intelligence. Like Renée mentioned, I'm actively involved in a number of health AI discussions through Brookings, helping to lead that health equity AI vertical. We've been convening thought leaders throughout the country to solicit their input and insight and expertise related to responsible and ethical AI. I'm also on the Consumer Technology Association's AI Health Work Group, where we're looking at standards around artificial intelligence to ensure that it is safe, reliable, and effective. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. Hello? Okay, there we go. My name is Sarah Jeroman. I'm the Policy Associate at NCSL's Health Program. NCSL is the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I cover all of our work related to health technology, so this portfolio on health AI, but also our portfolios on healthcare facilities and healthcare costs. And for those of you who aren't familiar with NCSL, we are the national bipartisan membership organization for all state legislators and legislative staff across the country. And our mission is generally to advance the effectiveness of legislators and their staff and how they're performing. And so particularly with this issue, actually before I do that, I will just mention that we are bipartisan led and our staff are nonpartisan. So I will mention trends in states, different state examples, but NCSL doesn't advocate or support any legislation at the state level. So it's really just for informational purposes about what's going on in states across the country, as well as the territories and the commonwealths. But how we're viewing AI right now is we're kind of just convening with our members. I think, like a lot of us, they're at that foundational level of trying to get information. What is this technology? How is it being used? Can it be used to expand the capacity of my workforce? How do I create those protections for patients while also potentially increasing their access to healthcare? And so we do that in a number of ways by convening them with different experts around the country, but also just getting them to talk to one another. So if another state has done something that was particularly successful, getting them in the room with others to say, hey, we tried this, what have you tried? And particularly, I think we haven't talked enough about legislative staff today. They are the keepers of institutional knowledge as we go through elections, and they are particularly helpful when it comes to figuring out these types of issues and thinking them through.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone introducing themselves. Now let's get started with the program, roll up our sleeves. I have prepared some questions for our guests, but I would like for this to be very engaging and interactive. So please raise your hand at any time to ask a question if you have so. You guys ready? Awesome. First question. And you'll notice that I didn't use the questions that they gave us to ask you guys. I came up with some of my own. Okay, I'm going to start off and jump out if you want to. What ethical implications do you see arising from the use of AI in healthcare, and how can legislation address these concerns?
Well, I can start. I'm on? Fantastic. I think when we think about healthcare, we're thinking about all the ethical questions. So it's about accountability, it is about transparency, it is about explainability, interoperability, bias, discrimination, just every ethical concern impacts healthcare. The other challenge would be, how do we legislate these questions? Because one, we don't truly understand the impact of this technology, the long-term impact of the technology, as well as the technology is changing so quickly. So we had AI, now we're in Gen AI, and there are just so many different versions of this technology that's being deployed. What we want to do with governing AI, we want to ensure that we remain competitive. We want to ensure the things that we're doing are innovative, but we also want to ensure it is responsible, it is safe, it is trustworthy. So the challenge is, how do we legislate and create space for it to be human-centric, create space for it to be responsible, and create space for it to be safe? But I think healthcare is like criminal justice, it's like education, it's like everything that we are experiencing and engaging with at the moment. And the challenge is at the international level, there really is no binding legislation. The World Health Organization has been trying to build the level of cooperation and collaboration and coordination that's required to create something that's harmonized across regions, of course across states, and just on the level of practitioners. And the other challenge is how not only to make it safe for the individuals who are accessing healthcare, but also the practitioners and the professionals who are using it. Questions around liability, questions around risks. How do we reduce those risks? So I think any kind of ethical concern that you can imagine, that is an ethical concern of healthcare intersecting with AI.
Sarah.
Yeah, I could jump in here as well. And so I think this is an issue that states are really already contending with. And so legislation related to health AI specifically, there's been about 50 bills introduced this session. But if you look at AI regulation generally, there's almost 500 introduced in 45 states, the territories, what have you. And there's a bucket of legislation that we are putting as responsible use. And so it would basically prohibit any legislation that would prohibit or limit the use of an AI tool that could contribute to any potential algorithmic discrimination for members of any of the protected classes or perceived members of those classes. And so we've seen some states introducing legislation like that. In particular, there was one in Oklahoma, actually. It did not go through, but it would basically, any algorithms that are used would have to go to their Department of Transparency, and they would have to then certify whether that algorithm could have any bias. I don't know why that's getting louder. But there's also this other legislation that is a little bit more, less related to health, but could impact health. That's just general standards for developers and deployers of AI. And so on that developing side, so if you have tested it, telling the people who are going to be deploying it what data's gone into it, or telling them if we did see that there is a potential for discrimination, you have to tell that deployer before you actually sell it to them. And so there is, I think, a lot of stuff happening at the state level where they're trying to think through potentially what is the best use of this. And then not to take up too much time, but I think there's also a lot of bills at the state level, which are study bills, task force bills. So saying, can we get a bunch of people to the table, and what do we have to think about to try and do this? So a lot of these legislators aren't big into tech. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. So how do we get the tech experts here and say, what should we be considering, the community experts, and then all going to the table to say, maybe we'll do this next session?
And my colleagues did a great job of talking about some of the ethical dilemmas related to AI, as well as some of the legislative areas. One thing that I will talk a little bit about is legislation is mainly focused on R&D and the development side. So what are we doing in the post-market side? And some people are calling this the iterative AI space, right? So as AI continues to iterate, do we have guidelines, standards to be able to evaluate harm, effectiveness, reliability, and all of these things? So I think that as we think about this first foray of policy in terms of the pre-market space, we also have to consider the post-market. Because the post-market is where these algorithms continue to iterate, they continue to evolve, and that's where we see them doing harm. And harm hasn't been appropriately defined. And so we don't necessarily know when an algorithm is doing harm from a standardization perspective. Some folks have opined about the definition, and they have defined it for their general purposes, but across the board, it hasn't been standardized in terms of what that means. The last thing I will talk about is, along with legislation, we also have to think about governance. And governance needs to reflect an interdisciplinary view so that all the stakeholders that are involved in the use and deployment of AI have an opportunity to voice their concerns or approval of an algorithm or data set that is being used to train the algorithm, or also being used to scale the algorithm in terms of its application and use.
How do we define and measure the success of AI legislation in terms of improving health equity and outcomes for marginalized communities?
Well, the challenge there would be the fact that the legislation, as we've heard, has not really been harmonized. At the international level, there really is no, as I said, the World Health Organization is really at the moment trying to come up with some sort of binding legislation that sort of mimics what has been happening in the EU. The EU has their AI Act. They also have a Data Act, and since 2016, they have the General Data Protection Act, and these three have come together to create legislation. In the U.S., we don't have any binding AI legislation. We have voluntary compliance, but we do have the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was produced by the White House 2 years ago. Last year, we had an executive order from the president that spoke about how we need to think about AI, how we need to think about those risks, and how do we ensure it's safe and it's trustworthy and it's secure. And most recently, there was a federal memo for federal agencies to really bring a sense of public oversight into the ways in which we're thinking about the technology, and to really share with the public the kinds of algorithms that are being used, the impact assessments that are being done, the kinds of risk assessments, and questions around field testing of this technology. So there is no legislation to really measure. We can't really measure how legislation is impacting the general population for us to even think about how it's impacting underserved, high-need communities. What we do know is many of the risks that we continue to see are appearing in these communities. As a criminologist and criminal psychologist, that's something that I look at from the perspective of the criminal justice system, and much of my work speaks to data trauma, the ways in which I track the ways in which data transmits intergenerational trauma in underserved and high needs and marginalized and minoritized communities. So what we do want would be much of the legislation that you're speaking about to happen in a harmonized way, so we can have the standard operating procedure that you're speaking about that's required for us to come up with, overarching sort of definitions and approaches. Yes, sir.
Sure. Should we get him a mic? Is there an extra microphone?
I just want to know, is there widespread opposition to legislation in the United States that would maybe mirror some of the legislation that has been in place in the EU, for instance?
I don't think it's opposition. I think what we have are, every geographical space has a different approach. I think the approach in the U.S. has been voluntary compliance, and companies are attempting to self-regulate. Several instruments have come out of the White House, as I said, the Bill of Rights, the executive order, and this federal memo that are supposed to guide and govern. I think the idea is we don't want to over-regulate because we want to remain competitive. We want to remain innovative. And as you have probably read, the US and China and the EU, all of them sort of trying to get to the AI finish line. So if you over-regulate, then you may, there's a lot of fraternities that believe that innovation and ethics cannot exist in the same space, which I don't believe that. I think if we do ethics by design, if we do equity by design, if we do safety by design, then we're doing AI in a way that's responsible, in a way that also stretches the creative imagination of the designers and the deployers and the entire community that works around it. I think the approach here is we don't want to stymie innovation, so let's leave it a little broad. So you would appreciate the 5 biggest tech companies in the world that own all our data exist in the United States. And the United States is probably the only geographical space that continues to deploy the products beyond TikTok that is coming from another space. So I think it's that. So there really is no opposition. But the good news is there are lots of fraternities that are advocating for stricter, more robust and more rigorous guidelines. And at the national level, the government is doing so many different things. There are so many committees, so many groups. We now have a National AI Safety Institute that's going to field test just about every algorithm before it hits the street. So when it comes to advocacy, when it comes to governance, when it comes to really raising those questions and having a really solid community, we do have that. But I think when we think about tech legislation, those are questions that speak to greater questions around monopolies and antitrust and the ways in which countries are sort of build their own economic infrastructure that's also dependent on this technology. Sure.
Thank you. Yeah. How can community voices be incorporated into the AI legislative process to ensure that policies reflect their needs and concerns?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There was actually an enacted bill in Washington, which is Senate Bill 5838, I believe I got that correct, which actually created their task force that I talked about. They're studying all of AI. There is a part of that is studying access to healthcare, how AI is going to impact the delivery of care. And within their bills, they line up who has to be on those study committees. And for theirs, there has to be one advocate from a community-based organization on each of those different task forces that talks about these different issues. And so a lot of states are putting these task forces together legislatively, and some of them have really started to prioritize community-based organizations, patient advocate organizations, trying to get really everyone from the healthcare system, so health plans, providers, facilities, what have you, and making sure everyone has a seat at the table when we start to talk about these issues, because then they're going to be tasked with making recommendations about future legislation to the executive branch, the legislature, and all of that.
And I'll just add that there's a lot of efforts afoot at the community level to help build understanding and awareness of artificial intelligence, because you want to make sure that when people are at the table, that they have the right information, capabilities to be able to advocate at a very high level for the needs of what everyone deserves and how these tools could be used effectively. So I think that community organizations, patient advocacy groups are starting to look at AI in a very meaningful way. The American Diabetes Association now has a individual responsible for artificial intelligence, and I'm starting to see a lot of these patient advocacy groups designate someone to have purview over their artificial intelligence portfolio, both internal and external facing. And I think that that will only help support the legislation that Sarah is talking about in terms of governance. One thing that I'm increasingly concerned about is that AI as a technology changes so quickly, right? So the expertise that you need today might not be the expertise you need tomorrow. So even from a legislative perspective, the legislation that we're crafting and passing at the state level, the tech is moving so quickly. When we talk about predictive AI, deep learning, machine learning versus generative AI, you're talking about two completely different things. But if you ask someone like my mom, what is AI? She thinks that the robots are coming to get us. So that there's this chasm between public, industry, and government around what it actually is. And I think that from a policy perspective, we could try to better define it from a nomenclature perspective so that it is generally understood across jurisdictions and even with equity. We are in an echo chamber. We talk about it all the time. But when you go out and talk to the general public, they define it differently, right? So how can we even standardize the definition of equity and how we talk about it so that we're all speaking from a common perspective? So then when we get to the policy making process, that we're all coming from a shared understanding of what we're communicating and talking about.
But Michael, with that being said, how can we improve public understanding then and trust in AI technologies, especially in communities that have historically faced inequities in healthcare?
I think it's the tried and true process. I think we were having a conversation outside. It's about going directly to the community, enlisting them, speaking to influencers in the community to get buy-in, to see what the actual needs are. Sometimes I think there's a misalignment between what someone might be perceiving the community needs versus what the community actually needs. Coming up with doing all the things that we just talked about around discrimination and bias, having a transparent and explainability process that people understand what an algorithm is, what data sets are being used. All of those things go a long way to building trust. And what we know that healthcare is premised on trust, right? Absent technology, absent the trust, people don't show up to the doctor, they don't show up to their appointments, or they don't feel comfortable with the feedback and insights that they're receiving from the clinical provider because maybe they don't trust. And so I think what we need to think about is holistically, how do we reinforce and continue to build trust with the public, and how does that relate to technology?
Certainly, that is one of the most challenging things to do, because we know historically different communities have experienced data differently. So there are some communities that are totally intimidated by the word data, and some communities know that data could be something that accentuates and sort of highlights and creates a particular kind of trajectory for them. When I look at questions around data trauma, that's one of the first things that we look at, the fear when it comes to collecting data. We also know that collecting data is oftentimes linked to so many other challenges in communities. We can even think about immigration, where you have mixed status families as well. So when it comes to collecting data, in particular in underserved or high needs or marginalized or minoritized communities, it's very, very challenging. And then when you add the question around AI and trust, because we know one of the things that we're seeing now is disinformation and deep fakes, and most recently, I think within the last 2 days, a lawsuit against an AI company attaching suicide of a 14-year-old. So we know there are many, many challenges that are coming up more and more. And we know that when it comes to AI actually has a crisis of trust. because of the fact that we know that while the technology can do transformative and extraordinary things, it can also do some very, very dangerous things, and we're seeing those as well.
Speaking of that, Sarah, if you can give me your opinion on how can legislation ensure that these individuals and everyone in this room have easy access and secure access to their own health information, and what role does this access play in empowering patients to make informed decisions about their own health?
That's a big question.
Very.
But what I will start with, and it kind of goes off the last one as well, but I think a lot of people, when we're talking about legislators and the process in general, a lot of people don't realize that that's usually their second job. So they all have jobs first, and this isn't necessarily, not all of them, but most. And yeah. Yes. And so you're asking them to educate themselves on topics fully A to Z, and then go out and make informed legislation about it. And that's not always the easiest thing. And so I think for them, too, it's a really important part to do some of this educating with them, helping them to learn about it if you are these advocates, and going to them and saying, hey, I have these data sources, I have these stories for you, I have these things, so they can go out and do their job, and they don't necessarily have to do it all themselves. So I think that's a really important piece to this. And then I think the data part, I honestly don't have a good answer to that. That's something that we're really looking at. At NCSL, we have a Health Innovations Task Force, and we're currently focused on health AI in general, and it keeps coming up over and over again of how do I protect my data. They were like, it comes up when we did EHRs. These are all private sector companies for the most part. What do we do about it? And so we've been pulling in private sector people as much as we can to get them at the table and talk to our legislators, but I don't think there's really a good answer to that yet.
That's okay, we'll get there. Actually, if you don't mind me asking one of the legislators that's in the room right now, how would you answer that question?
State Representative A.J. Pittman here. Welcome to Oklahoma City.
Thank you. Thank you.
But I think I was going to re-ask the question too, because my legislative deadline is December 6th. And a lot of people don't realize that once we get into session, our bills are already built. And so how do we navigate outside of our lovely NCSL, working with these organizations to get model legislation that's happening in real time now? I think collecting the data is amazing and working out the kinks, but we have bills going through the process right now that people are not educating us about, that ALEC is having models, NCSL is having models, NBCSL is having models, where you have certain people in certain states that are doing it, but again, it's taking over the country. So how are we navigating, educating those elected officials in real time before we go into legislative session?
Thank you.
December 6th is around the corner. Tennessee is a state where they can draft language at any time throughout the year. Oklahoma is a state where we have a certain period of time where we have to draft our deadline. So our deadline starts December 6th, and then it ends, I think, January 29th, and our first day of legislative session is the first Monday in February.
Thank you for that. Actually, I want to thank you too, Sarah, for pointing that out, and everyone here on the stage, that we did not take that into consideration being constituent. So thank you for bringing that up. We may have another question here in the audience.
Thank you. Joy D. Calloway with the National Medical Association. This is the part of the conversation that drew me to this, and understanding where the Black physicians in this country can be helpful. You talked, sir, about community-based understanding and awareness, the trusted voices in the community. Black physicians are it in our communities. And so we are actively talking about this right now. I'm interested in what you were saying about the work groups at the state level. You mentioned a Senate bill, federal Senate bill, but this is impacting states as well. That was why I would raise my hand for some clarity around that.
No, Washington State.
The state of Washington. Got you. So that we definitely want to be part of this. We are a national organization. I'm certain there are places that we can plug in, but we're learning too. We are learning and want to be part of this movement. But of course, in representing Black communities, we are side-eyeing a little bit. It's a little bit more me than my organization, but we kind of side-eyeing this whole thing and want to make sure that we are part of the conversation.
And I'll say, I'll connect with you afterwards. And State Representative, I will connect with you afterwards as well. I think that it is such an emerging space. I mean, AI has been around for quite some time, right? We know that. It has played a significant role throughout society. I think it has become more amplified now because we're starting to enter areas that are very sensitive, such as healthcare. It has principally been used on the administrative side of healthcare. So revenue cycle management, they've been using bots, augmenting processes within the hospital and facilities. They've been using AI now in those spaces. Now it's becoming more consumer facing. And as it becomes more consumer facing, how do we make sure that we have the guardrails? One of the things that we're doing with the AI work group at the Consumer Technology Association is thinking about standards, because standards can help support policy to determine whether or not the tool is efficacious, it's reliable, and it's trustworthy. So this group, this interdisciplinary group of industry stakeholders, is looking at how do we suggest, not that we build the standards, as I'm not a standards developer, but how do we suggest what standards should be created to help hold some of these algorithms, data sets that are being used accountable, and that you can rely on. So if you have standards, then we can determine whether or not they're efficacious.
I'd like to piggyback off that quickly.
Please.
And I think in terms of holding it reliable too, I think states have also looked at it in terms of practitioner monitoring. So not passing bills, but introducing bills related to, so saying that if a AI makes a decision, I need either a provider, an administrator, someone who is qualified to look at that output, and then they potentially have the ability to override it if they believe that it's acting incorrectly. So saying that before it makes a utilization review decision for a health plan, somebody would have to actually look at that, check a box, make sure that it's actually correct before it goes through. Same with a diagnosis potentially. So some states are looking at it from that perspective of putting that human in that process, making sure that it can't just go through and do things that is patient-facing, what have you. So that's another guardrail that states are considering.
Can I just make one comment about that too, is that there are a number of decision support tools that clinicians are increasingly relying upon that have AI embedded capabilities. And one thing that we're constantly debating and contemplating within our system is how do we ensure that our providers are trained adequately so that they feel comfortable checking that box and attesting that the decision that they're making or being recommended is sound and grounded in evidence. And we need more evidence. Similar to how we bring a pharmaceutical product to market, there is an evidentiary standard. So we need to establish what is that standard of evidence that we need that providers feel comfortable suggesting that this is the way in which they want to go forward.
I have a question for the panelists. With that being said, how do we make this affordable? Because it sounds so beneficial. How do we make this affordable for our community health centers, our FHQs? Because what does this cost look like to implement this technology?
When you're talking about on a broad base, or
like say for the AI technology to help the efficiency for the patients, for the providers, and for the overall health of that center, how much would this cost for your more economically challenged health centers?
Well, I will say this. I don't know what the cost will be, and I don't know what the economics of that kind of infrastructure would look like. But the thing about AI is most of the interface that we're doing is on our phones.
Okay.
And that's what makes it so pervasive.
Okay.
So many times you just have to either access an app or there's just something that you're using your phone to do. So it is that immediate interface that is so intimate. But I also want to say something about the question of AI and reliability, is that we cannot get comfortable with the word reliability when it comes to AI, because it is always changing so quickly. So this is why we speak about doing those impact assessments. This is why we speak about red teaming and risk management, and always bringing a sophisticated level of due diligence and duty of care and understanding to the process. I mean, coming from the space of justice, what always leads my conversation in AI would be due process, because I always have to think about ways in which this technology could undermine agency, autonomy, self-determination, questions around our identity. So the thing about AI is its pervasiveness, and its pervasiveness and the access. Because most of us have been using AI. I mean, AI has been around for nearly 60 years. It is because of data science and machine learning and deep learning and many of the computer science and statistical approaches that we have now that the technology has become so much more powerful. So where there is promise, there is also peril. And we have got to think about the fact that nothing about this technology stays the same, and even the people who are building this technology still do not understand everything around the technology and why the technology continues to do some of the very strange things that it continues to do.
Well, it looks like we only have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to give each one of the panelists half a minute to say, what would you like for this audience to take away from this session? What would be the most valuable piece of information that you can share with this audience? Sarah?
I think my biggest one would be to remember to look towards your state legislators. We've talked about it a lot, but I think it does get a little bit lost that we're lobbying a lot at the federal level. But as community organizers, you do have state people who are making a lot of the decisions about your policy. And honestly, a lot of the time I interact with them a lot. They're great people. They would love to hear from you. And as I said before, don't forget about your legislative staff. They're also always willing to talk and would love to hear from you all about what you need.
I would say that you have got to appreciate that AI is not coming. You've already been using AI. You have already given away an extraordinary amount of your data. You already have an AI twin on the other side of that phone, on the other side of your computer. But you've got to upskill yourself in real time. You've got to go out there and engage with the knowledge. This technology is not going away. It is only getting stronger and more powerful. And most people always say to me, but am I really using AI? And I say, not only are you using AI, but AI is using you to continuously make decisions about you that you may not even be able to participate in. And one of the things that I want you to take away with this technology is this technology has the ability to create access, to create opportunities, and to create brilliant legacies. But it also has the opportunity to deny access, deny opportunities, and undermine legacies in real time. And every time an algorithm is deployed, an algorithm has the ability to really create access for someone to realize a dream or absolutely block access to the things that we need. And we've got to get very serious about our relationship with this technology, because at the moment, the technology is already sort of determining our trajectory, and we are not even participating in that.
Thank you for that. Michael?
And I'll build on it, Renee's last point, that one of the most transformative technologies that we've seen in healthcare is artificial intelligence. We have the ability to address some of these deep-rooted health equity issues, these health disparities that have been intractable in so many communities. But there has to be a balance, right, around what are those ethical guidelines? How do we ensure that everyone has access? How are we responsible? Because it allows us to get to that ultimate aim of personalized medicine. And if we could get to personalized medicine, then we can address some of the things that we always talk about in terms of these disparities in diabetes and hypertension and cancer, etc. So if I want to leave you with one thing, often technology and data is intimidating to some folks. I know a number of them that say, I will never be connected to technology. I will never give away my data, like Renee. But you know that you're already doing it. So I would say if it's a generative AI tool out there, you use it. Use it. But trust it and verify it. But you have to be an active participant, or AI will actively be using your information and data to do some other things. So thank you.
I truly appreciate your time, Renee, Sarah, Michael, for being AI legislative, I don't even have to call you soldiers or warriors, or making sure that you're putting guardrails up and we can balance innovation and ethics at the same time, where all of us in this room can benefit. And I'd like to thank you for participating and driving this crucial conversation forward. This is our time right now. And I'd like to thank you for yours. Thank you for joining us